I'm John Dickerson of CBS News. Welcome to our panel on school choice. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion and to hearing what the panelists have to say. In 1990, a woman named Polly Williams in Milwaukee, a legislator and a civil rights activist, started what is considered one of the first voucher programs in the country for 1,000 kids, low-income kids. By 2011, Polly Williams said, "It was never supposed to get this big." This is a story in miniature of one of the debates about school choice. Williams was worried that it was undermining public school. It's one of the discussions we'll have today, but it's also a sign of how fast and how big school choice has gotten. From that 1,000-person program in Milwaukee, nearly a quarter of Milwaukee students now use vouchers. Nationwide now, more than half of the states offer public funds for private education, and this school year, over 1 million K-12 students are going to be using them. So it is moving very fast. When I think about education, there is a quote from the writer G.K. Chesterton, who said, "Education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another." That word "simply" is doing a lot of work there. When you think about the soul of a society, that gives you some sense of the passion with which people talk about this issue and the intergenerational connections. So we will hopefully husband that passion in our conversation today, and we will try not to run afoul of Chesterton's other quote, which was that people wind up quarreling because they don't know how to argue. So I will introduce our panelists. Alberto Carvalho is the superintendent of the Los Angeles Unified School District, previously held that post in Miami-Dade for 14 years. Kara Fitzpatrick is the editor of the news organization Chalkbeat, also a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the author of The Death of Public School, a history of how school choice reshaped the American education system. And in the middle, Tommy Schultz is the CEO of the American Federation for Children, the largest school choice advocacy group and a key strategist behind a lot of these recent victories. Kara, can I start with you as the journalist and author in the room? Start us off. Give us a little bit of a sense of where we are right now in the school choice story.
Sure. So we are at a moment of pretty unprecedented spread of school choice in this country, and I think it's probably important to do a little bit of definitions here. So a charter school, does anyone know what a charter school is? Let's figure out the room. Okay. What we have are traditional public schools, which are secular, they're free, they're supposed to be open to everyone. Charter schools are considered public schools, but those are not under the control of a district. And then you have private school choice programs, which use public dollars to help children access private educational options. So I just want to make sure, because I've gotten to the end of these and someone's asked me what a charter school is before. So let's start with that. So for a long, long time in our country, school choice, especially private school choice, was theoretical. Lots of conversation about whether or not we should give money to kids to access private, especially religious education, but no actual programs. We had some programs in the South in the 1950s and 60s, which were largely to avoid Brown v. Board. Those were struck down by the courts as racist, and then for a while, nothing again. And so the Polly Williams story is essentially the start of modern vouchers, and for a little while, those programs were very small, and they tended to be targeted at low-income children, especially low-income children of color. And then, we had that for a while. We had a lot of court cases, and this last maybe 5 or so years, we've had just this massive explosion of choice with these programs spreading all over the country. It has for a while been largely a red state expansion, but I think we've reached a place now where we're at more than half of the states have private school choice programs. Charter schools are in almost all of the states, and we're sort of now reaching this place where the targeted programs that were largely for particular groups of kids, a lot of states are moving to universal, where it's for every child regardless of income or particular need or disability.
Excellent, thank you. Tommy, before I come to you, because a lot of those victories are because of your work, Superintendent Carvalho, let me talk to you about, you have, as I understand it, 280 charter schools I don't know if that's in in your unified school district or not, but 400,000 students. Give us your experience with charter schools.
So actually our system is the second largest in the country, 540,000 students, 25% of whom attend charter schools. Two types of charter schools in LA, much like in Miami. In Miami, I ushered in the very first district-managed charter school type of entity, which was really a very different type of schooling. Charter school, independent board, but the business services were managed by the district. And I thought it was actually interesting because as I was creating this new school choice opportunity, both the national unions were opposing it, but also the traditional charter schools were opposing it. And I thought, wow, these are perennial enemies. If they're both opposing this, I must be onto something pretty good. And in fact, it turned out to be a great experience. I arrived in LA, and in LA we have two types of charter schools. Some are truly independent charter schools based on the traditional charter school model that is seen across the country that you spoke about. But we also have affiliated charter schools, which is the district's own recognition that certain communities perhaps can unite and make decisions to empower school leadership, the type of teaching in communities. And interestingly enough, the highest performing charter schools in Los Angeles Unified are actually the district-managed affiliated charter schools, as opposed to the independent charter schools. But in all, about 25% of our students attend charter schools, and then you have a huge percentage of students who attend other choice programs, whether they are pilot schools with additional autonomy and independence, magnet programs that offer very specific curriculum for interested students, or obviously the affiliated and independent charter schools.
Tommy, New Hampshire just had a big success for your movement, and also Texas is on its way to basically universal school choice, right? And you have a friend in the president, so the wind is at your back.
Some pretty cataclysmic changes that have been happening in the school choice movement. As you alluded to with the early programs in the 1990s that started out as very small pilot programs for 1,000 kids. After nearly 30 years of work, in 2020, about 500,000 kids were using some form of a mechanism to go to a private school with state funding. From 2020 till now, it's now about going to be, for next school year, 1.4 million kids. 2020 was about $3.4 billion being utilized for these private school choice programs. Next year, depending on a few other policies that may come about, $9 billion. So huge hockey stick graph, but what's interesting is that it's pretty uncontroversial at the parent level, right? So you'll see survey after survey showing 70% of their public schools they're very much happy with, but 70% also want school choice, right? And especially lower income communities, because they're usually the ones that, as your reporting is done, I mean, they are the ones impacted most by this public education system, which is necessarily harming lower income families. Because how many of you in this room sent your kids to a private school or went to a private school? Okay, well, so the average, in America is about less than 9%, and this looked like about the majority of the room, right? How many of you maybe moved to a better school district? You changed addresses, right? The people who have the means to do so choose better schooling. So in this system that we developed essentially in the 1850s and put on autopilot, this district common schooling system, it sort of doesn't make sense compared to dozens of other countries in Europe, Latin America, even Canada, which says they do a more student-centered funding model that says go to the school that best meets your needs. And that's what these private school choice programs are doing. It's a version of what charter schools are doing, which says we want to give families more options and give them the opportunity to attend these schools. And that's why they're both wildly popular for parents, but then also COVID really shifted the Overton window on this, right? So the reaction to COVID in particular from the big schooling unions that said, we want to keep schools closed as long as possible to extract as much leverage to get as much money out of the federal government, right? And then we got $192 billion additional sent to K through 12 public schools for K through 12 reopening and learning loss. Our learning loss is at record lows. And to think about in context of what $192 billion is, that would have been enough to give every single teacher in America a $60,000 one-time bonus. So where's that money going, right? And what's happening to the learning loss? This is why you've seen this move afoot at the state level from state legislatures saying, we need to fix something. This is a crisis. We now have seen fully how political this system is. Why not empower families to just control their education funding, go to the best school possible? And I think the future, what that means is you're actually going to have education entrepreneurship. We've already seen in Florida that dozens and hundreds of public school teachers, former public school teachers, are now starting private micro schools in their community, right? There's a wave of innovation that's coming in the next decade, really, because so many states are putting parents in charge of their funding versus just a system that says, here's an arbitrary budget allocation for a range of schools. So big changes afoot, more to come.
Alberto, do you hear parents talking about choice and the need for it in the same way that Tommy just described? And what has your experience been with parents who have felt like they want more opportunities for their kids?
I think that's a very good question. You know, there are two types of parents in our communities. There are demand-sided parenting, and there's supply-sided parenting. Demand-sided parenting is exercised by parents who absolutely know where the great programs are, where the great schools are, and they're so demanding of a quality education for their children that they actually know the principal and the best teacher in their classroom. They want their most gifted child in that teacher's classroom. And by the way, based on John Hattie's effect size, a parent who decides or is engaged in making decisions that are in the best interests of children provides that child a huge catapultic effect in terms of their success. Supply-sided parenting, unfortunately, these are the parents. They're too tired, too overworked, usually lack some degree of knowledge and education. They themselves were not necessarily well educated, and they don't know how to advocate for their children. And that makes a big difference. But I think parents ultimately, actually all parents ultimately want what's best for their kids. I think the issue is many do not know how to approach the conversation, who to speak with, how to decipher the wide array of choices available in one community. And by the way, sometimes they make the wrong choice. They choose a choice school just because it is a choice school, but that school may not necessarily be performing any better than their traditional neighborhood school. But I think parents more and more are becoming more aware of the offers available. More and more they're able to discern between performance indicators, whether it's reading proficiency, math proficiency, graduation rates, more and more aware as to how dollars are spent in their child's school through transparency tools that allow parents to have greater insight into school budgets. But look, I want to mention one quick thing here. Charter schools, and I've been, when I became superintendent in Miami, 30% of the kids were engaged in public school choice options. By the time I left, 85% of the students were engaged in public school option choices. That's a huge, huge number of kids, considering the fact that Miami-Dade is the third largest school district in America. LA is the second, and as I said, if we take into account traditional charters, affiliated charters, and then the plethora of choice options, over 50% of the kids in LA are engaged in some form of choice. I believe in choice. For those superintendents or educators who say, you know what, charter schools scare me, I'm not going to deal with that, I'm going to oppose it. You know, charter schools and choice is like the incoming tsunami. You're not going to be able to outrun it. If you try to duck under it, you're going to drown. You're not going to be able to outswim it. The only way to benefit from it is actually to surf the top. Be the provider of the best choice. And I think that's actually one of the collateral benefits of the choice movement to traditional public school districts is that districts felt compelled to actually innovate faster, develop their own internal choices. I think that was a great outcome. On the other hand, I think I've leveraged that aggressively. So I don't engage in a debate, charter versus non-charter, because I think that's the wrong question. Good education is good education, however it arrives at the kid.
Amen.
Period. That's where the debate should end.
Amen.
We ought to be a bit concerned, however, with this truth. Charter schools have been around for about 30 years now. And as you correctly said, about 50 states, all 50 states basically have charter schools, but the membership in charter schools nationally is still below 20%, actually below 10% at this point.
Yeah.
Yep.
So my point is, if our fixation with charter is the only effective strategy to improve public education in America, shall we wait another 30 years? Is this a 60-year innovation revolution to benefit kids? My question is, how many kids will we lose while the adults are trying to perfect their skill to actually impact kids? So I think we got to be better. There are other things in addition to choice that I think we need to focus on, such as a very different school year We're still teaching kids 7 hours and 20 minutes a day, 180 days a year, punctuated by annoying as hell bells every 60 minutes, in schools that don't conform to the way kids learn, with sterile walls that bore kids to death. We're paying teachers pretty much the same way we paid them 50, 60, 70 years ago. And the construct of public education is still dictated by a set of policies that no longer work. So I think we need to do both things simultaneously. Provide amplified choice. I believe in public choice, primarily. But at the same time, look at the construct of American public education and ask the question, do we need to redesign that as well to capture the interest of kids? We need to personalize much more than what we've done thus far and need to abandon this concept of education as being provided only inside of a building as opposed to creating diversified environments where knowledge can be acquired by students at their own pace.
I can anticipate, I think, what Tommy, sure, clap. It's good to get exercise. What Tommy's argument might be for letting the private school choice bring some of those solutions to the top. But before we get to that, Kara, I want to know from you, as people try to evaluate in their own minds how good choice is to the kinds of outcomes that they might want, how good is the data? Is what's the smartest data to look at in terms of answering the question whether and how much choice solves some of the challenges that schooling faces?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I found really interesting in researching choice. One of my questions was, is this a solution for some of the inequities that plague public education? That was one of the things I wanted to know. I think it's a hard thing to evaluate because there's so much variation. When you're talking about charter schools vary by the community that they're in, by the state that they're in. The models vary, so it's very hard to just say, here are charter schools and here are public schools and which one, traditional public schools, and which one is better. The research that has attempted to do that for charter schools has generally found that there's some very, very successful charter school models, especially in urban areas that are accessed by low-income children, very, very successful models. But if you try to look at overall, just across the country, they tend to do about as well as the traditional public school. They're pretty close. So, you see people kind of cherry pick this research, but that's the answer. They're about the same in a lot of ways. For private school choice, again, not an easy thing to evaluate. And when you're talking about 30 years of research, some of the research early on was looking at very small groups of kids. Now we're getting more kids. So it's just keep that in mind. There's caveats with this.
Right.
But private school choice programs, there tends to be very high parental satisfaction, which probably is because a parent is choosing something that aligns with their values, or it's convenient, or whatever it is. Academics, some of the larger programs of the last few years, it's been about the same as traditional public schools, or in some cases a little worse, particularly in math. In some cases, there's been a case made for, well, students, when they move over to a new school, there's a period of adjustment. So maybe you'll see test scores dip, and then maybe they'll rise again. So there's conversation around that. And then for life outcomes, which I think is also important to look at, private school choice programs, there's been research showing that some of the kids participating are more likely to finish high school, more likely to attend college. We don't quite have whether they graduate, because again, if you're going to follow a kid from a young age through college graduation, that program had to have been there for a long time. One also sort of caveat, I think, with this body of research is that most of these studies were looking at the targeted programs. So the ones that were for students with disabilities, the ones that were for low-income children, and now we're moving to universal. And so hopefully we'll see another wave of sort of research looking at the outcomes there and have more to sort of discuss. And then I think the other key question is, what does choice do for traditional public education? And there's a fairly good body of research that says that competition does in fact improve public education. You can kind of dig into that a little bit because there's different ways of improving it, and people argue about some of the policy implications. But if you have, and I think Dr. Carvalho alluded to this, but if you have someone next door who's saying, hey, come here, we have this great program, we have IB, we have STEM, whatever it is, and parents start looking into that, then what is your answer as the traditional public school?
Right.
Probably to unveil some program that will try to draw some of those kids back. And so there's that sense of maybe improving curriculum options, choice programs, all that. There's also some interesting research that says that when you have a certain percentage of charter schools in a district, so in a school district in that larger landscape, that the public school district also improves some of these metrics.
Which affirms a key argument made by the choice advocates, which is basically
it does.
Lifts all boats.
Yes, it does. The only caveat I would say to that one is that one of the ways that it improves that educational landscape for everyone is that some of the lowest performing public schools close. And so from a policy standpoint, you could say, yes, we want our lowest performing public schools to close. Why wouldn't you want to do that? And on the other hand, you could say, as a lot of, I think, public education advocates would say, well, put more resources into those schools, try to improve them, with that.
Right.
And so it's a complicated.
Yes, it is. That's why I asked you. Thank you for helping uncomplicate it, or at least help us understand that the complexity is not our limitation, but the limitation in the data. Tommy, what data do you point to? But more importantly, how many answers and the challenges that schooling faces can be answered by choice? As the superintendent said, there's a body of people that are taking, making their choices, whether it's universal or charter or whatever, but there's still a lot of people going to public school. Where do you stop in terms of 100% of the kids that go to school, how much of the challenges those kids face can be fixed by choice?
Great question. So, and you also asked about the research studies. I think the most important research studies that have come out in the recent years is from Dr. David Figlio. He's examined Florida and Ohio, two of the states that have the biggest market share of private and public school choice options. His Florida data is some of the most compelling, showing the competitive effects, right? That the more that a district school has competition between a charter and a private school, the better that district school does. And the ones that have fewer options, that school district performs worse. His new study in Ohio in particular also compounds upon that and is very similar to some other aspects of his Florida study, which showed particularly black boys, students in poverty, they're up to 50% or twice as likely to graduate from college with a 4-year degree. And to actually kind of set an even, just to give a sense of the scale of the problem that we're talking about, because we're talking at high levels about some of the mechanics and the engineering of the system, but let's really dive into how bad it is in some of these places in America, right? I've often pointed to Baltimore in many of my public speeches. John, what percentage of Baltimore high school students passed the exit exam, the math exam in 2017? What percentage of students do you guess passed that math exam?
I have no idea.
Anyone, Diane, would you like a percentage guess?
You didn't know you were going to get called on, did you?
Got to get some audience engagement here.
Yeah. No, they look perfectly engaged. Give us the answer.
Well, so normally I'll hear, the average answer I hear from the crowd, they say 30%. And I usually retort that no, it wasn't 30%, it was only 14%. But the actual data, it wasn't 14% of students, it was 14 students in the entire city of Baltimore that passed the high school exit exam.
In the public school system.
In the public school
For
system.
math?
In high school and math. Which a columnist, Walter Williams, who passed away a few years ago, he wrote a column after this. He said, if you were the grand wizard of the KKK, could you design a better system at disenfranchising black students than the Baltimore public school system?
So school choice can solve that problem.
Well, and at the end of the day, when you're looking at the interventions that 25% of private school choice programs are occupied by black students, 30% are occupied by Hispanic students. They're getting these test score outcomes, long-term outcomes in particular, that Dr. David Figlio and others have pointed to, especially in the largest programs out there. Kara mentioned there were very targeted, clunky, small programs 20, 30 years ago, but now as these programs are reaching a scale of population, the competition and the more options that are available for families, bright superintendents like Dr. Carvalho here said, let's embrace this. Why don't we treat every kid as our own versus saying there's this public versus private divide? That's the only way to solve this, because in my view, if you look at all of the history of philanthropic and government interventions into our public school system, recent ones like the federal school improvement grant, $7 billion, the federal government report that came out afterwards said it did nothing to move the needle. Gates Foundation, all these other major philanthropic enterprises that have poured tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to try and fix the public school system within itself, they all became to realize this is a very political system, one with arbitrary constructs around what can you put on the walls of the classroom or how can you design the school bells, et cetera. We need to reimagine the system, and the only way that I see that we can do that and where we've proven that is when you put parents in charge of their kids' destiny versus the arbitrary 5-digit letters, their zip code that says, here's your path, good luck.
Alberto, parents are in charge because they can send them to school choice. So, to charter schools. So what worries you, if it does, about, say, universal choice in California, where through vouchers or education savings accounts, you could go to private school?
Not likely to happen in California.
I was gonna say,
Well,
probably not
We're
there.
here to push the boundaries of the imagination.
I'm afraid that whatever I'll say, I'll get fired. But it's okay, because when I became superintendent 18 years ago in Florida, as I signed my contract, I told the board, just like I told the board in Los Angeles, that I'm going to come to work every day to try to get fired. Because if you don't risk, if you don't operate from the edge of the abyss and really do the right thing by the kids, regardless of consequence, you never achieve anything. So I will indict private sector enterprise that does not focus on the child, just like I will indict equally, with the same level of fervor, public school systems and superintendents who say two things. Number one, it's the kid's fault that they can't learn because X, Y, Z, poverty, language limitation, disability, etc. And those are significant issues that we need to consider. But they cannot be turned into excuses that explain dismal performance. Or the other thing is, I can change a district, but give me 10 years. An effective reform effort takes 7 to 10 years. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Any superintendent says that, fire him. Fire the superintendent. What I don't understand is the political forces in America, whether we're talking about Congress, state legislative bodies, elected school boards, they jump to an alternative that would change fundamentally who's running the schools rather than changing the players. Sometimes you have a good horse, you just have a failure of a jockey. So before you trade the horse and the jockey, how about if you have a great horse, change the jockey, fire the jockey. I have no compassion for my colleagues who operate in public education who accept failure. I'm familiar with Baltimore's data, but I'm also familiar with Miami-Dade's data. Miami-Dade's data. When I became superintendent, graduation rate 58%. By the time I left, 90%. When I became superintendent, I told you the percentage of kids in choice programs, 30%, 85% by the time I left. Number one district in the country in advanced academics with black and brown poor kids, okay? Outpacing the state performance in terms of gains and the country measured by the only thing that matters, which is a national assessment of educational progress, the gold standard of performance across the country, which, by the way, not because I left, but Texas and Florida, under the last assessment, both tanked. And of course, the secretaries of education for both states said the instrument must be wrong. Parenthetically, Los Angeles Unified improved. So what is it? We need to be very, very honest about what we measure, how accurate it is, and not try to politicize the message about the results. Interpret the results for what they are. So, going back to your question, and I appreciate the opportunity to expound a little bit. I believe in public education, just like I believe in U.S. government, just like I believe in the Constitution of America, just like I believe that the United States of America ought to have a U.S. Army, not the private army that defends our interests. I'm concerned about that. Just like I believe in the city of Los Angeles or the city of New York or the city of Chicago or Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in having a public police department. I would be very leery of bequeathing to a private sector for-profit entity the safety and security of my city. Just think about that for a second. Do I believe in competition and choice? Absolutely. Do I believe in giving 100% of responsibility without some degree of accountability? I have concerns about that. So let's talk about performance. Vouchers, kids who take vouchers across the country are by and large not mandated to take state assessments. So the data that would evaluate their performance is faulty at best. Once you go into the private sector, you lose eyesight on their performance, comparatively speaking, to kids in public schools. Now, NAEP does not, because NAEP actually tests.
Yep.
And I have to say, I served 2 terms appointed by President Obama and appointed by President Trump, the only guy in the country, on the NAEP governing board that determines assessment policy for the country. And there is a pooling, a sizable, statistically significant pool of students across the country from private sector schools. And guess what we find? That usually the trends are the same, much like you said. Overall, across the country, charter school performance, 4 states that actually produce rigid, accountable statistics, because there are states, unfortunately, that screw kids by lowering the standards to produce better results. Shame on those secretaries of education. Shame on those governmental bodies. We shouldn't have that. But across the board, charter schools, on average, perform par with traditional public schools. With that said, why are we fixated on that? I'm fixated on where are the outliers in both sectors? Where are the outliers in the traditional public school sector? Where are the outliers in the charter school sector? And I will even say, because I love to steal anything that's not copyrighted, bring it to my district and make it my own, if it is the best practice. So I will steal from private schools, I will steal from charter schools, make it my own if it is the best practice. We often are mesmerized by the governance at the expense of the best possible practice that actually helps kids.
Can I say something about test scores?
Please do.
So I think this is something that's sort of interesting that is worth unpacking a little bit, because test scores have been one of our main ways of holding public schools in particular accountable. And with some of these programs, you do have kids take a norm reference test, so it's not exactly the state test. You have some where they do take the state test, and you can try to sort of compare. It's not a very good way to do it, but you can. But I just want to say, I think it's there's a fallacy a little bit with only focusing on test scores, in that some of the ways that we achieve those test scores in the classroom level are not actually what I would consider a good education, right? And so just on a personal note, and I'll just put this out there because I think it's interesting as a parent, I have 3 kids, and when we went to public school in New York City, and then we moved a couple years ago because my kids got tired of a New York City apartment, the test scores at our public school, our zoned neighborhood public school, and this is a school that's around half low income and predominantly Hispanic, very good test scores. And so if you were evaluating the model of that education based only on the test scores and you didn't set foot in the school, you would think they have pretty good test scores for New York City. One of the ways that they get those test scores is by doing a crap ton of test prep starting in 3rd grade. And so what I sort of watched and was interested not only as a parent but as someone who writes about education, you watch sort of all of these worksheets come home and all of this test prep, and there's not a lot of recess, and science was once a week, PE gym was once a week. We didn't have a band program. We did have art. We lost our art teacher. We didn't have a librarian. And so I think it's interesting to sort of, on a more granular level, a lot of these conversations are often trying to assess the entire system across the country, which is tough to do, to look at, well, what is education actually supposed to be about? What is it actually supposed to be for? And how do you sort of look at that as a parent? Do I want my child to have art? Do I want them to have band? These sort of less tangible things. And then we moved 45 minutes north of New York City and kind of bought a house based on the market. And we sort of lucked out with the school district, very small. There's 2 schools in the entire district, and they have worse test scores. And so I was looking at this as an education person going, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what the difference is here. Is it that they don't care so much about the test scores? Is it an opt-out movement, which was big in New York for a long time, where you'd say, I don't want my kid to even take the test? So that school has half the number of kids in the class. They have band. They have PE 3 times a week. They have science. They have an outdoor classroom. The resources are much higher, and they don't care about the test scores. Sure. So my kids are doing all these project-based, learning. And I think we got a notice about the test a week beforehand that said, hey, by the way, the state test is next week. Make sure the kids have a good breakfast. There was no 3-month march to the test of worksheets and prep, and this is what you're going to see on the exam, and all of this sort of intensity around it. It was just, hey, by the way, next week is the state test, and by law in New York, you should take it.
Right. Yeah, and they're.
And so I think those conversations have to like also look at that. You know, what are these other things? Because we've seen with all of the testing kind of a narrowing of curriculum in places where they really want those high test scores, but what is it measuring? You know, and I just think that should be part of the conversation.
Having interviewed
Too complicated.
plenty of teachers who hate to teach to the test,
Sure.
it takes all the thrill out of their.
Well, and are we teaching civics, which isn't on the test? Are we
Right.
teaching history? You know, all of those
Goes
questions.
back to the right,
Yes.
which unfortunately we have about 5 minutes till questions, so start formulating them in your mind, and microphones will be going around. Tommy, I want to ask you about accountability. That idea was raised. Yep. You know, obviously there are flaws in the public school accountability system, but in terms of choice, where does accountability come for some of those larger goals that we think of when we think of education? And let me just slide in a secondary question, which is that what does a rural school district do when it's got, you know, there was, I'm sure you read the piece in the Atlantic from the school administrator in a rural district in Tennessee who said basically, why do our tax dollars have to go to subsidizing rich people in Nashville? And there has been some data that show that private school tuition price increases where there's universal public schools. So address that. And this was not, you know, this was not some lefty making that quote. This was somebody who was a supporter of President Trump's in a district that voted for him by 50 points. So address accountability, and then what do you make of that rural argument?
Yeah, we deal with the rural argument in red states all the time. I sometimes will point out my own personal example that I grew up on a farm, very rural area in Northern California. My parents believed in my own education so much they were willing to send me to a modestly tuition Catholic school. They're willing to drive me 60 miles each way to do it. We have parent survey data that actually shows that when you actually interview rural parents, you ask them, how many of you would be willing to drive your kid more than 25 miles away if you could go to a better school for free? Majority of them say, absolutely, I would do it in a heartbeat. And these rural school districts, the actual underlying dynamic there is all political. So in many rural counties in America, when the schooling system itself, either directly or indirectly through contractors and you name it, account for maybe 60% of the economy in that given county, that's where you start to see, okay, there's a little bit more of a political dynamic here. I will also charitably say, if you go to your average like rural Texas school, we live in Texas now, many of them look quite like a private school. There's a lot of religiosity going on in there. It's a tight-knit community. And when the other side has been painting that, look, if you start a school choice program, it's going to devastate your rural schools, address the premise of that argument, right? Which is that, wait, you're so worried that everybody's going to flee your rural public schools because they start a private school choice program. You're admitting that people don't want to go to that school. The parents just don't, the parents get this. That's why parents in rural communities support this. And for those that say, too, I know the representative that said that word, or said that quote to the Atlantic, they talk about, look, the only reason I don't support this is that, yeah, my money's going to go to Nashville, it's a kind of also a slight that, well, those lower income Hispanic and black students might be getting that. That's always this underlying premise of these arguments. But set that aside, he said, you know, there isn't a private school for 20 miles in my area. A lot of data showing that's not true, but all you have to say is, well, do you have a YMCA? Do you have a church? Do you have any underutilized commercial buildings that are sitting empty? Because you could start a private school, high quality there tomorrow if you had a choice program. And so the more that parents get to understand this, and the more you really break down these arguments, that's why we've been so successful at passing these laws. And why you saw in Texas when 21 rural Republicans blocked the school choice program last year, only 6 of them returned to the legislature the following year, and all of them but 2 actually voted for the school choice expansion the following year. So at the end of the day, these have been the same arguments they've had since 1990, that this defunds public schools, this is bad for rural students. And time and again, in places like Florida, where they've doubled the number of rural private schools that have started in their rural counties in the last 10 years, or you look at the countless examples throughout the rest of the country, we've been proving these arguments false just with the data, with the parent experience, and with the overwhelming demand for these programs. And accountability, you mentioned. We're firm believers in accountability for families. The number one accountability that always comes into this, though, is if a parent can't leave that school, if they're angry, if they're for whatever reason, and the only way to do it is to pay private school tuition or to pay to move out of the district, that's a really bad system, right? And that's just the nature of this monopolistic system, which says, again, if you have the means, you can do it, like everybody in this room seemingly did. Whereas we want a system that makes it equitable for everybody. They can go to the school of their choice. We'd like to see test scores, nationally normed reference testing being done There's great new testing regimes that are coming out that I think will be better for teachers, easier to administer. It's actually actionable, like the NWEA map test. 30% of schools are using that. There's more to come that I think now that you have a more innovative system, you can actually implement these things versus the top-down, one-size-fits-none system that I'm borrowing your quote that you said when you were in Miami, right? So
we're about to have question time in about 15 seconds, but Alberto, very quickly, have you seen some of the criticisms of choice have been cream skimming, which is to say that the best students go off to other schools, and then also that teachers might, that it might affect the teacher experience? Have you seen either of that?
Those are arguments, that there's a degree of cherry picking, and in some cases it is true. But I personally have not professionally seen, just the skimming of the top of the high-performing students going into charter school programs, number one. Secondly, as far as teachers are concerned, teachers make decisions based on a set of conditions. Can I teach on the basis of the skill set that I have with the least interference possible? Am I being compensated fairly for my work? And am I treated with respect? Those are the three key issues. And I really don't necessarily see significant differences between the traditional public school system as well as the charter school system. May I take 30 seconds? I know we're going to go to questions. Sure. To address some of the thoughts that were just reflected. Look, and I have to confess, I come to this stage always with my own lived experience. And as I said earlier, public education saved me and made me. I am an immigrant to this country, came here alone at the age of 17, was once homeless, slept under the bridge, blocks away from the office that years later I would occupy as superintendent. Only in America could that miracle happen. So great respect for what teachers and education do every single day. Second point, I just want to challenge this audience because, a lot of heavy hitters and, great players here, and I know many of you. There's a reverse psychology associated with the private sector engagement of public schools. So some will choose to see only private sector as voucher creating and supporting entities, but there are people here that actually are doing the reverse, who are saying, I'm a private sector entity and I have great ideas and possibility of investment in your public school system. Are you willing to listen? So we have Karen Fried there from Miami who had that conversation with me. And they don't have to spend money or time in this, but they're spending time, treasure, and talent saying, I can help you transform public education. We have Melanie Lundquist out of LA right here, who's invested millions of dollars, much like Karen Fried and Jonathan, into transforming public schools through shared accountability and management of a sector of the lowest performing schools in LA. It's working. And then we have Ms. Cardozo with the Chuck Lorre Foundation says, you know what? You need music and arts programs in public education. Can we partner? So I want the private sector conundrum that some people drown in to not just be seen through one single angle, but actually be seen through the portfolio of experiences, investments, and partnership can actually catalyze transformation in our public schools across America.
We have a question in the front row. Wait for just a moment for the microphone.
Hi. I think we're missing one important point. I am the director of a teacher training program. I think some of you've heard of Science of Reading, Orton Gillingham. Mm-hmm. And whether it's charter or public, when we go in and train these teachers, because the teacher pool is not like it was when I grew up, you were either a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary. They need more training. Mm-hmm. And what I found, because I'm all about impact, is that we follow the teachers, we coach them for a year and do follow-ups, and whether public or charter, they have doubled and tripled their scores. Because literacy is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. When I helped establish the Institute of Literacy, 80% of American children read on grade level. Today, it's more like 30%. So I think we have to address this.
Do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah, the panel, my question is, how are you addressing teacher training in reading?
Who wants to take that? Go ahead, Alberto.
I'm a big fan, number one. I think it is the stupidest thing in American public education, private education, that we actually know how to teach kids how to read, and we fail to do so because we do not follow the science of reading. We say as a nation, we follow science, and then one important science that empowers educational attainment, and there's nothing more important than ensuring that kids reach reading proficiency by 3rd grade. Because if they don't, the research will prove they will not graduate on time or at all, and more than likely, a huge increase in the probability they will end up in jail. So it's the best possible investment. Science of reading, for 40 years, we've had research that indicates it is the right, appropriate way to teach reading. But the status quo and the influence of some heavyweights within the teaching profession want to continue to do what they've always done because it's worked so well. They don't want to change the ways. Science of reading, I believe in it. What must be done across the country, we're doing it. We did it in Miami. Mandated in LA. You cannot mandate anything in LA, so it's more nuanced. An incredible level of professional development to really teach kids, phonics, phonemic awareness, comprehension, understanding. That is what works. We need to fundamentally change the way we teach reading in our classrooms, and the science is there behind it.
And I'll just add a comment. I mean, it goes to the nature of the system, which he was pointing to, right? I mean, we spend $1 trillion a year. How unserious are we that we abandon the core principles of how to teach our kids to read, right? And then we're saddling teachers up with debt to go to education colleges that don't teach them how to be better teachers, right? And then all of these things there that, again, the nature of the system, who fought for those changes, right? Who likes the way the system is, doesn't want it to change? If you ask that question, you follow the money.
Because there's an economy of failure, right? Yeah. There's a whole industrial complex that hopes that kids fail because their job and the way they make money is on the recovery. I'm serious.
They get more money.
Yeah. Of course.
Well, also, I think in general, teachers need more training, right? I think, yes, because just again, as a parent, we've done lots of writing about the science of reading, and there's been a lot of
got more questions
of stories about it. But I've seen teachers. I had 2 kids go through basically balanced literacy, which made 0 sense to me, and I was watching the harm of it. With one of my kids who came into kindergarten already reading, but they still had him do some of these things that just made no sense. It was like, say the word one way, say it a different way, and see if you can just suss out which is the right way. What? That's not, that makes no sense. And now I'm seeing my 5-year-old who's come into kindergarten in this latest wave where they've changed the curriculum, learning in a way that actually makes some sense. So it's a real issue.
I wondered, anyone can comment on this about AI and education, because it seems to me we have an education system right now that is the way we teach is primed to be taken over by the machines, right? And that we need to inculcate kids with skills to allow them to succeed in the era of AI. And how does a public top-down monopolistic system do that, address that?
I just want to say, we keep referring to the public education system as a whole, and I get why, but the hallmark of American education has always been local control. So what New York City does versus what, a town in Wyoming does are not the same things.
Yeah, we know who's in charge in New York City. I mean, can we just talk about it? How do we address AI?
I think there's different ways to do that, but I think, there's nothing that can really replace a teacher. I think that's a tool that teachers could use potentially in different ways, but you can't replace a person who cares and who is there with kids every day. I just don't think you can. So
I'll approach it differently. Much like charter schools, innovation, for those who believe that AI is something that may or may not stick, they're wrong. Within 5 years, nobody will recognize the reality that we'll be facing. And education is not immune to it. Education, entertainment, journalism, you name it, AI is there. So either understand AI, be schooled, including kids in public schools, either understand AI and master AI or be ruled by the machine. Either embrace the new economy or be a victim to what will be the new economy. It's very, very clear. AI is powerful and dangerous at the same time. Talk about the life of a teacher in 15 seconds. AI can aggregate all resources you need for the classroom, can plan your entire school year for you to be able to dedicate more personalized attention to kids. AI can help you with lesson planning. AI can organize your communication with your parents. AI can segregate or can differentiate by performance and need your entire classroom so that you can homogeneously group kids on the basis of what they need. With that said, AI can allow a teacher and a student alike to defer too much of the critical thinking attainment to the machine.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher in Miami. I teach at an independent school. And a point that hasn't been brought up is that these voucher programs are pushing out quality teachers to independent schools. I would love to still be in public school. I'd love to be teaching lower middle class kids like I was raised. That's my passion. But, you know, for all of the economic things and stuff, I can't afford to live in Miami not working at an independent school. So how does that work? And we're talking about teacher training. I got my best training being a public school teacher. I worked at Head Start for 5 years. When I got into independent schools, I was way ahead of any of the other teachers there, because I had been getting from Baltimore. I'm from Baltimore City, so I had been I've been working at Head Start in Baltimore City, and had been at schools that were really, really pushing things. And the other thing that is really difficult for me as a teacher is that I worry about the quality too. I mean, I'm a high quality teacher. I know what I'm doing, but I can teach my kids whatever I want, right? I teach them Spanish. I've never had a problem reaching learning goals in any school, in any country that I've taught in. But my problem is, you know, I went to private school. When you asked that question, I raised my hand. But it was kind of a false thing, because then you said, well, you all are here. Look at all these people who went to private school. When I went to private school, I learned creationism. Do you know how long that took me to catch up in college and all of these things?
So what's the question?
What's the question for you all? I guess my question for you all is, how do we keep quality teachers in schools when they're getting better options? How do you keep quality teachers in public schools when they're getting better options in this?
I mean, I think you have to pay them more and give them better working conditions. I was telling someone last night that my sister's a special ed teacher, and you know, some of the conditions that she faces, it's ridiculous. And she has colleagues who leave to go work just about anywhere else and has better pay and benefits. And she's working with very impacted kids. She's working this last year with kids who are violent, have injured her colleagues. And, you know, I don't want to say what my sister's salary is, but she's a teacher, so it's not a lot. And, you know, we have that conversation. So I think you got to look at pay and working conditions.
Well, I would say on some aggregate data, just for some high level, you know, we're spending $20,000 per kid per year in the public school system writ large. Average private school tuition, 80% is within $6,000 to $9,000. Teachers are getting paid probably 25 to 30% less in private schools, nationwide average. Your average public school teacher is gone from the classroom in about 3 to 3.5 years. What does that say, right? I mean, and there's this cottage industry of a system, union, bureaucracy, you name it, that says we'd rather push our teachers into the bureaucratic enterprise rather than the classroom. All these kind of things that Kara's been talking about. Again, this schooling union system that brings in $3 billion a year in dues money is fighting against many of these sensible reforms within the district school system. So I would say, I mean, I care mostly about how is the kid learning, regardless of the setting, public, private, charter, you name it. We're agnostic, right? And I'd love for our best teachers to actually stay in the classroom. And it's quite clear that the public school system is doing a very good job of pushing our best teachers out. We have tens of millions of teachers on the sideline, amazing human capital that, to your point about AI, many of them can start their own new schools, can use these kind of proctoring or tutoring methods that an AI can enable to give them more leverage, alongside, I hope, public school reforms that AI, that they don't just ban it outright. Or, I mean, the public school system has been very good at really resisting any sort of tech intervention into the system in the last 25 years that we've seen. So my hope is that with this new and flourishing system we're getting in Florida and getting in all these places that are allowing for all options and all boats to rise, our best teachers can actually stay in front of as many students as possible.
We've basically hit the clock long ago, so this is going to have to be the last question.
Okay, I'll make a simple one. We haven't really talked about, we peripherally talked about religion with her question, with her bringing up creationism taught to her in a private school. And Tommy, you talked about rural public schools being more religious, I went to a private school, and I was not the religion of that private school.
Yep.
I think there's an importance in secular education, and I think there's a fundamental importance of a differentiation between church and state. If we're taking public money and paying for education, don't we have an obligation for secular education?
It's interesting. I mean, the courts have been dealing with this really important question for the last 100 years, essentially, right? And because if you actually back up to the beginning of our country, right, the public schooling system was a Protestant schooling system, essentially. The private schooling system was a Catholic schooling system. We tried to put in, both at the federal constitutional level, something that restricts access to private schooling, and it was an anti-Catholic move. But then as the Supreme Court in the 20th century said, no, we're going to really detangle much of the religious elements of our public schools writ large, I mean, that's had a whole series of changes. But the courts have also affirmed that there's these Blaine amendments that they're called, because James G. Blaine, who tried to put this on at the federal level, 30 other state constitutions put in these provisions that said public dollars cannot go to private institutions. The courts have been roundly saying that's actually a discriminatory policy against religious families, because America was founded on religious pluralistic desires, right? And that should be reflected in the broad range of which we do this. And when parents get this funding, they're not mandated to go to any school that in the environment, public, private, charter, religious, you name it. Parents are freely choosing, just like they do with Social Security money, what they do with Pell Grants. They can go to religious institutions. This has widely kind of been affirmed in the courts. And when a recent case where a public school said, we don't want this local Lutheran pre-K school to get access to recycled truck tires that we're basically giving out, and they said, no, they can't get that because that's a violation of church and state. They took that to the Supreme Court and won. At the end of the day, I think Dr. Ashley Berner from Johns Hopkins makes the best argument on this, where, again, it's uncontroversial in dozens and dozens of other countries in this world where we freely and uniformly fund kids to the school of their choice. And there are regulations that come on top of this for, if you want to take your funding to go to a private school, here are the regulations. Each state, each country does this a little differently. I'd rather have a pluralistic system, which in our current environment, you pointed to the NAEP data, on the Catholic school breakout of the national report card data that we get, Catholic school students are 2.5 years ahead of their public school peers. I mean, do we have an obligation to serve the students in the best way possible, or to say artificially that, no, like, despite court cases and despite kind of certain principles, we only want money going to secular institutions despite parents not wanting that? I'm in the case of, we need to do whatever is best for kids and parents and families for the long-term health of this country, and in particular for our lowest income students who, I mean, they're at 40 and 50-year lows in this testing data, and we sort of paper over that for some kind of high-minded beliefs that, like, well, we want to argue on these kind of marginal issues. Well, look, the kids can't read, the kids can't do math, they're going to poverty, they're going to prison, or worse. We have to fix this, and the only way we do it is making these big systemic changes, in my opinion.
Albert, the last word is yours.
Yeah, so you'd have to be blinder than Ray Charles to not understand the fact that often behind this obsession, as we should, as a nation, have with where our kids are in terms of performance, there are ideological interests, whether they are political, religious, or otherwise. You have to be blind not to see it. So I say that because, look, public education is the cornerstone of our democracy. Public education and democracy are two sides of the same American coin. Undermine one, the other one will suffer at some point. Yes, traditionally, some private schools, not all, but some private schools do move the needle faster. There's a reason for that, beginning with what we know. Parents made a decision. Parents made a decision to send their kids there. There's greater control over societal influences over those closed environments. So what is the solution? The solution is, shall we send as a nation all of our kids to Catholic schools? Of course not. No. So that cannot be the solution. So what do I really care? Focus on best practices. What are the best pedagogical practices that teach kids, all kids, poor kids, white kids, black kids, immigrant kids, English language learners, students with disabilities? Divorce your mindset from governance and focus on best practice. And I think that is the fundamental need that we have in our country. Less focus on governance, less focus on the politics of education, more focus on best practices and the restructure of the school day, the school year, and what it takes to actually empower teachers in the classroom. Respect, pay, better training, and better working conditions.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for joining.